Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome to Arbeia Roman Fort here in South Shields in the northeast of England. And in today's episode we're going to do a short episode on Roman burial practices and the looking after of the dead. Now, when you think of the Romans, you probably think mostly of their buildings and things like that, but the Romans had quite a complex way of caring and presenting the dead for the afterlife. Now, the Romans were very, very careful about where they buried their dead. Whenever you walked into a Roman settlement on one of the main roads, that's where most of the tombs would be. And when they had all of these tombs, you would have memorials to the dead, you would have locations where friends and family could go out and they could make sacrifices once a year for the souls of the ancestors and those who passed away. They were very careful never to bury the dead within a settlement, and there was always a clear separation between the dead and the living because they didn't want the dead to come back and affect the way of life of people through maybe something what we today would call haunting or by curses and things like that. Quite humorously, at some locations, when they've discovered these tombstones, they've also found graffiti that says, please do not go to the toilet here, because as you're walking into a city, you can imagine some people might want to quickly use the loo before going in somewhere, just like maybe today when you're stopping at a service station or a garage, you might need to use the loo as well. Well, there was a tendency in the Roman world for people to go in these cemeteries, which again clashes with our modern understanding of how we respect the dead as well. So again, it's quite funny to see that with the way we view the Romans of having a quick wee just at the local tombstone before you enter the city, and how that was actually a real problem for Romans and their concern about how their tombstones would be looked after they passed away. So right here we can see the different periods of Roman burial. So at the top we can see cremation urns. Now during the Republican period into the early imperial period and right through to the middle of the empire, paganism was the dominant religion and faith of the time. And so when it was the dominant religion and faith, what people would do is that they would cremate their dead. When they cremated their dead, you would have a large funeral pyre which would be over the top of a hollow. When you had the funeral pyre over the top of the hollow, you would place the body on top, and when you placed the body on top, it would burn and eventually the ashes would drop down into the pit. You would then gather together some of those ashes and some of the cremated bone into a small little pot like this, and you would bury it in a location where you knew where you could return and pay homage to the person who had passed away. More wealthy Romans, on the other hand, they would actually have a tomb, and that would be a location where you could go back, remember them, maybe a gravestone or a grave marker. And then obviously the largest and most wealthy Romans would have mausoleums, like the Mausoleum of Hadrian or the Mausoleum of Augustus in the city of Rome itself. So what you would do is once you had these cremation pots, you would place little items that were associated with the person while they were alive in the top of the pot. So maybe you would put a coin or their favorite brooch or an item like that in the top of the pot, and then you would bury it. And so these would be the pots that people would use to hold the cremations. And they could be just general cooking pots that you had around the house, or more specifically designed pots that would be a little bit more fancy for the cremations. As you go through the Roman period, as you get to the 3rd century, near the end of the 3rd century into the 4th century, Christianity becomes a more mainstream religion in the Roman Empire. And as it becomes a more mainstream religion, Christians bury their dead and they don't practice cremation because of the belief in the resurrection. When they believe in the resurrection, they believe there's an importance of keeping the physical body for when Christ returns, and so that you would raise from the dead with Christ. So because of that, the person would be wrapped in a white cloth if they were poor and just buried in the ground, or the wealthier people inside of a coffin. And so because of that, we start seeing skeletons in the archaeological record, because this is the new practice. And even when it's the new practice, it even impacts on pagans, and there's also a bit of mixing of ideas. So there would be some people who would be Christians, but they would still maybe pray to the emperor or pray to certain gods at certain festivals, and Christianity had an impact on their way of life, but never hugely to the same extent where they would fully become Christians. while others would fully become Christians, and so they would hold firmly onto their beliefs. But nevertheless, where they were on that spectrum between pagan and Christian, we see more and more burials in the ground and fewer cremations, because that becomes the fashion for the way that you handle your dead. Now, when you have that, we start seeing the skeletons buried. And so here we have some of a male, a female, another male, so a young male from 18 to 20, a female woman who's what would be considered middle-aged to old age for the Romans, and then an older male as well as a child's skull there too, as well as some grave goods. So we've got a wonderful hairpin there made out of jet, a little necklace, and a knife. So these were goods that were buried alongside the person when they passed away. And we sometimes can see what would have mattered to the mourners, because one of the things when we're looking at graves and stuff like that is the person who's died, they don't get to choose what they get buried with. It's what the people who care about that person put in the grave with them that tells us so much about them. So obviously the people who cared believed these were important things to the person who passed away, and so decided to bury them there with them. At the bottom, we can see murder victims from the 5th century, and this comes from the very late period right here at the Roman fort. And these are quite interesting burials. So they come from the 5th century when Roman power has started to fail. These are 2 young men who were found within the commanding officer's house, and they were buried inside the Roman inside the Roman commander's house at the end when the Roman control has really collapsed in the area. The interesting thing about them is when we've had a look at their bones and they've been analysed by archaeologists, unfortunately these 2 young men were left out in the open air for a while before they were buried, and it seems that their bodies were just left there and they were chewed on by dogs or wild animals until the point where eventually someone gathered together their bones and hurriedly buried them underneath the commanding officer's house in that area. So what we can see here is maybe a location where control has fallen apart, and we can come up with a theoretical hypothesis of what may have happened. These young men may have been Roman officers or some young men who were connected to the Roman government in the area, and when they were connected to the Roman government, there's maybe been a mutiny by local soldiers, or there's been a raid by barbarians, or let's say, for instance, Germanic barbarians coming across, or the Irish crossing the Irish Sea and raiding around the area of Hadrian's Wall, or even the Northern Britons coming down as well and raiding this region. And then when these guys have been killed, they've then been left in the open air. The raiders have maybe moved on, and when they've moved on, their bodies have been eaten by wild animals, before finally maybe one of their friends or some of their old comrades have come back to the site, found their bodies and hurriedly buried them before leaving as well. So you can create a little hypothesis about what may have happened here at the end of Roman Britain and when the power and control of the empire is slowly fading away. Side by side with that as well, though, we also have a child's burial, sadly of a less than 6-month-old child, which shows again in the past infant mortality was quite a risk, and sadly this young child has passed away but has still been lovingly buried, probably inside of by family members inside of the barrack block. And when they've been buried there, that's probably because of the traditions of the people who are in the area. And across Hadrian's Wall, we actually do occasionally see people buried within the walls of a Roman fort. There's actually a good example at Vindolanda where there's a young girl who was likely a murder victim, but there is also another possible theory that her particular people that she was a part of, because she's found to be from France, may have buried their dead within their buildings to be close to them. So it could have just been that the traditions of that particular group had overridden Roman culture, and so they buried their dead within there rather than it being a case of a murder victim. Though the majority of archaeologists would probably go along the lines of a murder victim, and so you can see the difference right there. I really hope you've enjoyed this video today and you've learnt a little bit about the burial practices and the way the dead were treated in the Roman period, how they went from being cremations right the way through to inhumations and burials, and then we have these 2 unfortunate young men who were murdered in the late Roman period as all power was slowly collapsing around them and the world as they knew it was falling apart. As always, I'd say if you've enjoyed the video and you haven't already, please subscribe to see future videos in the future. And alongside that as well, if you have enjoyed and would like to support me further, you can support my Patreon, and where you can actually have an influence over some of the content that I'll produce in the future. Otherwise, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to telling you more in another video in the future. Until then, stay safe and well.